Their refusal to do so will result in military conflict, commenced at a time of our choosing.
So what many people feared has come to pass. There is going to be a war against Iraq, and it's imminent. In the end, the decision to go to war came swiftly after the US, UK and Spain withdrew their UN resolution yesterday morning. It was clear that they'd abandoned any attempts at further diplomacy. And last night, as George Bush delivered yet another of his ultimatums to Saddam Hussein, which we all knew Baghdad would reject, it was obvious that this was all just a bit of a charade. Well, whether you're for this war or against it, what's absolutely clear is that this is a terrible moment for the world. Politics and diplomacy have failed. The international community is in crisis. The UN is seriously damaged. Tony Blair has divided his party and country. And worst of all, of course, many ordinary people on both sides of the conflict are all tonight terrified about what lies ahead for them. Tonight on Prime Time, we look at the failure of diplomacy, question what kind of a war it's likely to be, and examine the likely humanitarian consequences.
And later I'll be reporting from New York on divided opinion in this extraordinary city on President Bush's planned war.
The President of the United States, with all due respect to the wonderfulness of this country, has not been anointed by God to be the one to determine when a certain country should be taken out.
So now that war is imminent, what kind of a war is it going to be? What form will it take and how long might it last? Primetime's Adrian Lydon has been talking to military strategists.
Events in Iraq have now reached the final days of decision. Saddam Hussein and his sons must leave Iraq within 48 hours. Their refusal to do so will result in military conflict.
Diplomacy failed, war is imminent, and the coalition forces are ready yet again to take on Saddam. But compared to the Gulf War in 1991, they're in a much stronger position. The majority are American, but include British and Australian forces, and account for 270,000 troops currently deployed in the Gulf. A further 200,000 are either en route, have received orders to deploy, or have been placed on alert. They have a highly trained air force and a strong Navy presence.
Much better equipped. Everything except, of course, the British soldier's rifle is hugely improved. Precision guidance has come on a long way with GPS-guided munitions. I think the warhead technology is much the same. It'll be the normal high explosives, but the accuracy with which you can place it is better. But I think even better than that, it's more reliable now.
On the other side, the Iraqi force is estimated to have between 300 and 350,000 troops at its disposal. It has a depleted air force and its navy is non-existent. The majority of Iraq's troops are conscripts who are in a state of disarray. The remainder is either in the Republican Guard, Saddam's elite force consisting of 80,000 men, or the Special Republican Guard, effectively Saddam's palace guard with around 20,000 men.
Coalition forces start with a number of very important advantages. First of all, they are extremely competent. Both the British and the American forces are well trained, they are well led. Conversely, the Iraqi armed forces are either conscript and poorly paid and poorly led and poorly equipped, absolutely ultra-modern state-of-the-art kit for the coalition, obsolescent, untried, old weapons for the opposition.
The bombs that fell during the 1991 Gulf War had a very limited aim. In the end, Saddam and his troops were forced out of Kuwait. This time the troops are facing a very different war.
In 1991, the coalition ground invasion was preceded by 38 days of incessant air attacks. On this occasion, I would expect to see probably no more than 2 days of very intensive strikes right the way across Iraq. Government buildings, command and control, perhaps barracks, military targets right the way across the country to induce a sense of shock, which will be followed immediately, again, as I say, perhaps within 2 or 3 days, maybe less than that, by ground force invasion from the south or from any other bases which we have by that time.
But already the coalition strategy has had some difficulties. It looks as though Kuwait might be the only country used as a launchpad for the ground forces. Turkey is still undecided on whether to allow coalition troops on its soil. Jordan and Saudi Arabia, fearing the adverse reaction of its people, will not allow coalition forces pass through its borders without UN backing. Either way, the troops will have to move quickly to reach their target.
The concentration has got to be Baghdad, because that is where Saddam and the government is. And the overall objective on this occasion is to overthrow Saddam and establish a different kind of government. And therefore, whatever the strategy, that is going to be the focus.
The optimists hope that it will be very short, that we're talking another sort of six-day war type scenario. A bit difficult to see how that is practically achievable short of an instantaneous surrender.
And it's mass surrender that war strategists are clinging to this time. During the 1991 war, they deserted in their tens of thousands, thanks in part to a well-organised propaganda campaign.
It will be a case that worked so well last time. If you march towards us with a white flag and your hands up, not carrying a weapon, we will not harm you.
You're all right. You're all right.
And this time, that propaganda war has been underway for several weeks.
The army has been especially targeted by the coalition. They've been leafleted in their camps, and there are a couple of radio stations now directed at them, basically telling them to stay put, not to come out into the open desert in battle formation. If they do that, they'll be annihilated by coalition aircraft.
I don't think the main army will fight. I don't think all the Republican Guard will fight. The question is, how far will the Special Republican Guard, closely related, dependent upon Saddam Hussein, how far will they fight?
This is a force which is stationed inside Baghdad for the protection of Baghdad and the protection of the regime itself. They're reasonably well trained and they're equipped with light weapons. The majority of that Special Republican Guard is probably loyal to Saddam Hussein and has some sort of clan tribe to Saddam Hussein himself. But again, an Iraqi said to me, these Special Republican Guard will probably fight. They will probably fight to the end because they know that when Saddam Hussein goes, they have no future. The only future they have in Baghdad is hanging from the lamppost. The center of gravity of the regime, Saddam Hussein, the Ba'ath Party apparatus, the Special Republican Guard, and the elements of the Republican Guard which are loyal, will almost certainly be centered around Baghdad. And if there is a great battle to be fought, it will probably be in the Baghdad area.
Fighting in a built-up area is costly in lives, ammunition, resources. There's more chance of friend-on-friend engagements. There's more chance for something to go wrong and for civilians to be killed. The Allies, I think, will be very loath indeed to try and clear Baghdad street by street.
I mean, I wouldn't say in this case that the coalition military planners are as dim as that. They know that if they go and they fight a big battle inside Baghdad, that's what will happen. So they'll try an alternative. They'll probably ring Baghdad with troops and they'll try and get Saddam Hussein out of it peacefully.
Either way, ringing Baghdad or fighting street to street is likely to prolong the war. Add a possible biological and chemical threat, and the consequences could be disastrous for the coalition. But the Allies and some commentators strongly believe that it will be a short war. If it isn't, there could be serious implications.
If this should become a long and protracted war, the first implication will be that the coalition has miscalculated. It has miscalculated the extent of the opposition within Iraq itself. And that would have extremely serious political implications. If success is not swift, i.e. a small number of weeks, then I think we would have a very, very serious international crisis.
Adrian Lydon reporting there on the type of war it's likely to be. Well, what's certain about this war, like every other war that's gone before, is that it will result in immense human suffering. A recently leaked confidential UN report on the humanitarian consequences of war for Iraq suggests that among many other things, around 1 million Iraqi children could be exposed to risk of death from malnutrition. And today we witnessed the beginning of a refugee crisis as hundreds of Iraqi Kurds began leaving their homes to travel to safer destinations. This report from Mike Malott.
For most of Iraq's 24 million inhabitants, life is already precarious, and the United Nations fears war could spark a humanitarian catastrophe beyond its ability to cope. Tonight we explore this looming crisis with the help of one leading expert, the Irish director of the main aid agency in Iraq, the UN Children's Fund, UNICEF.
The civilian population are always the most at risk, and particularly women and children because of the nature of war. 50% of the population are under 15. These are kids already whose nutritional status is extremely poor, whose medical status is extremely poor. So in terms of any further strain on that will cause huge loss of life. There have been 60 children who have died down in Basra from the Black Plague, and that's in the last couple of weeks. So there are all of these kind of diseases flourishing quite well as already in Iraq. If we can't get drugs in, if we can't continue to immunise kids, the diseases will just run rampant and thousands of children will die.
Once the best-fed people in the Gulf, Iraqis were reduced to destitution long before the current crisis. 13 years of sanctions aimed at Saddam have instead ravished the civilian population.
The long-term effects in terms of how the actual sanctions policy has unravelled the whole infrastructure in the country was never anticipated. 500,000 tonnes of raw sewage are pumped into the rivers in Iraq every single day. The water and sanitation infrastructure is extremely bad, and now the average child under the age of 5 has 14 episodes of diarrhoea every year, which account for 70% of the child deaths.
On the eve of war, 1 million toddlers already suffer chronic malnutrition, and 1 Iraqi child in 10 dies before reaching 5.
There are no drugs in hospitals. You know, doctors do have to make life and death choices about which baby they will put in an incubator because they don't have enough incubators.
People have survived at a minimal level only because of the UN's Oil for Food programme. Iraq's oil is sold for dollars on the open market. The revenue goes into a UN-managed bank account and is used to pay for food rations that are distributed to the population from 45,000 outlets inside Iraq. For 16 million people, this is the only food they get. But yesterday, as UN administrators pulled out of Iraq, the Oil for Food programme was suspended indefinitely.
The consequences are 16 million people are basically going to be in need of food within 3 weeks.
And can they be fed?
No. There isn't the resources at the moment to feed them. In terms of that number, nobody is anticipating being in a position to be able to feed that number of people.
And what will happen to them?
People will die.
No one can predict the length or severity of the war, but confidential UN memos using middle-of-the-range estimates say it could leave 4.2 million young children and 1 million pregnant women highly vulnerable. Over 1.25 million children are considered at risk of death from malnutrition. And if the war culminates in a battle for Baghdad, civilian casualties could be enormous.
People are really tightly packed because as people's sort of circumstances have deteriorated, people have literally sold off everything they can, including, if you like, renting out space within their homes. So it's not uncommon now to find people in their family homes, 2 families living, maybe 20 or 30 people to 1 room.
All-out war in this city of 6 million could cut its citizens off from the supply of vital aid.
The whole city is built on the River Tigris, so you know we're totally dependent on the infrastructure there, the bridge infrastructure. If the bridges are hit in any significant number, and it is anticipated that they would probably be the first, one of the first targets in the city, trying to move humanitarian assistance around Baghdad is going to be extraordinarily difficult.
Internal UN reports say 500,000 people could be in need of medical treatment, while the outbreak of disease in epidemic, if not pandemic proportions, is very likely. But shortages of essential drugs will hit within a month of the onset of crisis. By then, 5 million people could need emergency sanitation facilities and 2 million would need shelter.
It is anticipated clearly that the power plants and the generators will be hit. The impact on water and sanitation for that is going to be extremely grim. If there isn't a sanitation system, all of the water supplies become contaminated. So the incidence of disease in a country already which has a huge problem with sanitation and with clean water, I mean, again, we would be looking at huge loss of life.
Even a lesser crisis than that described will overwhelm relief agencies who are simply not capable of mopping up after this war.
UNICEF is the biggest UN agency on the ground with the Red Cross and Iraqi Red Crescent. We've been working very closely with both of those agencies, trying to pre-position aid. Many of the other UN agencies are not even on the ground and don't have a program there. We ourselves are saying we only have enough resources for a month. We even ourselves are not sure what numbers we can cope with. And so if this escalates in a particular way, or if there are huge numbers of internally displaced people, then the consequences and then the need for humanitarian assistance escalates as well. And we just don't have the resources, and we're the main agency there.
In fact, the UN has predicted as many as 2 million internally displaced people and another 900,000 fleeing the country as refugees. The budget for this war is vast. The US Congress was told a 6-month war and occupation could cost $56 billion. That's over $200,000 for every Iraqi. By comparison, UNICEF says providing 6 months' aid would cost $135 million. That's equivalent to just $5 for each Iraqi.
135 is the price tag for 6 months.
And how much of that have you actually raised? How much have you got?
Very little. We have pre-positioned $14.5 million worth of aid, which we have essentially borrowed internally from UNICEF resources. I think out of that $14.5 million, we've actually already received funding for about $6 or $7 million, so there's already a shortfall.
Other UN agencies are strapped for cash too. The Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs wanted $124 million. It got 38. The High Commissioner for Refugees asked for $60 million to care for 600,000 people, but got just $16 million, enough for only 180,000 refugees. The UN's World Food Programme wanted $23.5 million to feed 900,000 people. It got $7.2 million.
There is a great deal of reluctance amongst many donors to be part of any kind of effort on this because they feel that this is not a war of their making or choosing. And that's going to cause huge difficulties.
It has already led the UN internally to admit that severe funding constraints mean they are not reaching even minimum levels of preparedness, and to admit it could be facing a humanitarian emergency of proportions well beyond the capacity of UN agencies and other aid organisations. The notion that this will be an orderly war with few casualties, resulting in liberation followed by gratitude, is not one shared by many Iraqis.
People really abhor the prospect of war. People are terrified that they're going to be killed in their thousands. So there is no sense of welcome about this war, or no sense that people are going to be liberated. People are just very conscious of the huge number of potential civilian casualties.
Now, as war commences, the UN's unspoken fear of a humanitarian catastrophe will all too quickly be put to the test.
That report from Mike Malott. In America today, we've heard unprecedented criticism of a president on the brink of war from a leading Democrat. Here in New York, which is also a Democrat city, they have special reason to know about war and terrorism. The scars of September the 11th may never fully heal, but they do make this an interesting place to judge attitudes at this time. Yesterday, however, the streets of New York were marching to a drum that has very little to do with Saddam Hussein or George Bush, an Irish drum. St. Patrick's Day parade on Fifth Avenue and celebrations for the Irish. But issues of war were crowding in on those attending. You support President Bush?
Oh, absolutely, 100%.
No, I don't think we have enough support to go to war. I don't think there's a just cause for it either. So I don't agree with it at all.
So it looks like George Bush is going to war.
Correct.
How do you feel about that?
I don't think he should.
The famous New York skyline once showed the imposing presence of the Twin Towers. Today, that has gone, and with it American solidarity with many of its allies. Instead, there's a new sense of a beleaguered giant defending itself before its enemies get the first strike at it. At the UN, a grim diplomatic war of attrition has ended with the Bush administration isolated from much of the world. It has failed simply to persuade many of its allies of the need for war.
Iraq is a terrorist state. They demonstrated that by their support of Al-Qaeda. They've been mass killing their own people. They attacked Saudi Arabia to get a monopoly on oil. It's multiple casus belli, multiple causes of war. He's absolutely right.
I just don't understand why we're doing what we're doing at this point in time. I love my country. I want to defend my country. I want to defend our allies. I can tell you my feelings about Turkey too, and the $6 billion, which I think is ridiculous for a NATO ally. But I just think it's the wrong thing to do at the wrong time. And of course, if my country goes to war, I'm 100% behind it. But I just don't think we haven't given enough of time. I think we should go ahead and allow the inspectors more time with some more teeth in what they're doing there.
So you're worried that this could go seriously wrong?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, look what it's done for, when the United States works in a unilateral fashion by itself. Who are we with? England and Spain, right?
And Bulgaria.
And Bulgaria, yeah, whoop-de-doo, right? How are they in Ireland? I bet you they're right now saying, you know.
We're 50-50. We're
50-50.
for America and against the war.
Yeah. We are for America and against war as well. We say, at least Marie and I, hey, what's the rush? Is he going to attack us tomorrow? What's the rush?
Do you feel quite resentful about how America's allies have behaved, like the French and Germans, etc.?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I believe that they're fearful, or maybe they're being bought off by Saddam because, you know, whatever the reasons, because they, you know, maybe are making promises.
Maybe they're just against war.
I don't think so. Well, they might be against war, but I think that, well, I'm not sure that I buy that. I think that the French also have an ulterior motive, which is to control that whole area of Europe. This is what I've been told by a lot of people.
The city of New York knows all about terrorism, and you might expect that the city council here would be full square behind a U.S. president who wants to remove a terrorist threat and make New York a place where September the 11th never happens again. But in this case, you would be wrong. Because last week, the New York City Council, which is dominated by the Democrats, voted by 32 votes to 12 against a unilateral strike by the US against Iraq. The council supported efforts by the UN inspectors to resolve the issue.
In Europe, of course,
the proposer of the motion had his cousin killed in the World Trade Center on September the 11th.
The family has yet to recover from the loss. And we don't want to see a war fought in our name. That is, our president is using the attack in New York as a backdrop for why we should pursue war in Iraq. But those are not the reasons that we should pursue such a war, and we shouldn't do it unilaterally.
We here, especially in the city of New York, with the World Trade Center and all those 3,000 victims that perished, really understand that Saddam Hussein is an evil man, and he is linked to terrorism, and he has thousands of weapons of mass destruction, weapons that he is willing to use on his own people. What do you think they'll do to you and I? Certainly he would not be afraid to use them. This menace to society has to be stopped in his tracks. He's had 12 years in which to disarm.
When did we become the police of the world?
But you of all people,
who appointed them to be the police, us to be the police of the world?
Absolutely, but you of all people, given what you've told me about your family in the New York World Trade Center, you know the threat that there is, and there may well be no warning.
There is a threat.
The president is seeking, as he says, to eliminate the threat before another September the 11th happens. Now, do you reject that completely?
But the greatest threat that I think right now that is quantifiable is North Korea. We haven't, not Saddam Hussein.
Well, are you arguing for an attack on North Korea?
I'm not arguing for that. What I'm saying is that there's a contradiction between the idea of a preemptive threat and going after Saddam Hussein when the threat that is the most obvious, that has been the most vocal, has been North Korea. Why are we not doing that? The President of the United States, with all due respect to the wonderfulness of this country, has not been anointed by God to be the one to determine when a certain country should be taken out, when a certain leadership should be taken out. That's why we have something called the United Nations. We want to be the cop of the world. We have learned in the past that we are not the cop of the world. Let's not return to that. Let's fortify that international body called the United Nations and put it and make it work.
One striking aspect of opinion in New York today is the extent to which resentment against France has communicated itself from the Bush administration to many of the ordinary people.
Who saved the French? Didn't we liberate France from Normandy, whatever, too, in the Second World War? And they turn around and do this to us now? You know what I'm saying?
They're weasels. You know, how can you resent when a weasel acts like a weasel?
A weasel?
A weasel acts like a weasel.
Why do you think they're weasels?
Because they should be supporting us. They should be working against terrorism, having lived under Nazi occupation. Half the country lived under Nazi occupation for some time. They should understand that this is a similar kind of a situation and act in support of us, like Britain is.
Nobody, an American should not buy their cars, and the French, all the wine should go down to the toilet, excuse me.
You're laughing when you say it.
Yes, I mean it.
You don't look serious.
I look serious.
It's a bit of a joke, isn't it, all this business about the wine?
It's not a joke.
You really are resentful about how the French should behave?
Yes.
Why?
Because the United States was very good. Thousands of Americans were killed for the French. They saved their neck. Now the French don't want to do nothing. It goes back to history.
I have drank my last bottle of French wine. You know, I feel that France has really done a disservice to the United States and to all the veterans that died in France protecting their freedoms. It's a disservice to us in the United States.
In the history lessons, people appear to have forgotten how the French both inspired the American War of Independence and gave it critical military support. They may also need to recall that the Statue of Liberty, that great symbol of American democracy, was a gift from the government of what country? France.
Michael Heaney reporting there from New York. Meanwhile in Britain, Tony Blair has split his country and his party by deciding to support George Bush's decision to go to war. Already he's had senior resignations from his cabinet, including the Labour leader Robin Cook. And tonight there's a crucial vote about to take place in the House, which will be critically important for a Prime Minister already under siege. Earlier today, RT's London editor Brian O'Connell spoke to the British Foreign Minister Mike O'Brien.
Peter Kilfoyle said in the House of Commons today that this was illegal, it was illogical and it was immoral. What do you say to that?
We're entirely satisfied that we have the political, legal and moral basis for taking military action if we need to do so. The legal basis is very clear. It dates back to the authorization to use all means necessary in Resolution 678 of 1990. That was suspended by a resolution the following year, subject to Saddam Hussein disarming. When Resolution 1441 was passed last year, Resolution 678 of 1990 was reactivated on the basis that Saddam Hussein still had failed to disarm. It's explicitly stated in Resolution 1441 that he's failed to disarm. And therefore, the legal basis for taking action is very clear indeed. Now, the moral basis is also, I think, is clear. It is that UN resolutions matter and they must be enforced. International law matters and it must be enforced, and also we must prevent, for the sake of our future as a world, the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. If we can't draw a line after 17 UN resolutions on Iraq, where else can we draw it for the future of our children and ourselves?
If you had a legal basis, why did you need to go for another resolution?
The reason we're doing this is because we wanted to maximize political pressure. Look at how Saddam responds to pressure. The only reason the inspectors went in because there were troops building up in Kuwait. The only reason he started to dismantle the Al-Samud missiles was because the inspectors pressured him and said, this would be a clear breach if you do not. So he did react on both those occasions. So disarmament, a further resolution would have put increased political pressure on him and would have, I hope, caused him to disarm without resulting in military action.
On the moral basis of this, about half the country thinks that you do not have the moral right to do this.
Morality is not based on opinion polls. Secondly, in terms of the opinion polls themselves, what leaders have to do is decide what is right for the country and then do what they believe to be morally, politically and legally right. Tony Blair has made that decision. I believe it's the right decision. So do the vast majority of Labour MPs, and certainly whatever the opinion polls are saying, the opinion polls are moving in our direction in terms of recognising that someone has to do something about Saddam Hussein. Some of the countries may run away from taking the action that is necessary, but Britain will not run away from this, will not put our heads in the sand and pretend that Saddam Hussein will suddenly disarm if we all give him lots of time. We've given him 12 years. 12 years and 4 months since Resolution 1441, and he has not even given the full declaration that he could have given in 1 day. 1 day he could have given that declaration, and then we would have been able to see the inspectors have as much time as they want to complete the complete disarmament.
Let me ask you about unity of the cabinet. How can a Prime Minister have within his own cabinet somebody who describes him as being reckless throughout this affair?
Claire Short has today put out a letter to all Labour MPs, which I think will be public in a few hours. And what she said in that is that she's talked to Tony Blair, that effectively she set out a number of arguments which have been put to her, and she has accepted that the position of the government is one which she will now vote for. So I'm pleased to see that she's done that. And clearly the conversation she's had with Tony Blair since her claims that he was reckless, which she did in a radio interview, he's clearly set out the arguments much more clearly for her, and she's agreed that she can support Tony Blair, and she is supporting the government, I understand, in the lobbies tonight.
Can you explain one thing finally to me? How is it that a country like Britain can say it is enforcing the will of the United Nations, and when the United Nations Security Council isn't even given a chance to vote on the second resolution because it's withdrawn, as Jeremy Greenstock explained the other day, that you can go to a war to try and give authority to the United Nations when you're actually going against what the United Nations wishes?
We've got 17 UN resolutions requiring Saddam Hussein to disarm. The legal basis for taking military action is sound. Now, you may want an 18th resolution, and frankly, for political reasons, not legal or moral ones, it would have been helpful to have one. That's why we work so hard for one. It would have maximised the pressure on Saddam Hussein.
Tony Blair political cover, you mean?
It would, well, it would have, I think it might well have put sufficient pressure on Saddam Hussein to avoid military action. You know, I think we were actually that close to getting that second resolution that could have made a difference and prevented war. The French, by the action that they took a few days ago, have succeeded in doing precisely the opposite of that which they have publicly said they intended. They have brought forward, not delayed, military action. We could have had a situation where there was a resolution with an ultimatum which was not for today. We could have had a situation where military action did not have to be contemplated today if we had a united Security Council resolution saying that military action would be taken within a short time. It would have had to have been a short time. It takes 1 day for him to do this declaration, 1 day for him to say that he would disarm. He could do it still today, or he could leave Iraq today. But we have not been able to achieve that, and therefore we're faced with the only alternative available, which is to consider giving our own ultimatum within compliance within international law, and then to take military action if we need to do so.
British Foreign Office Minister Mike O'Brien speaking earlier in London to RT's London editor Brian O'Connell. And that's all from us for tonight. We're back again on Thursday when the Dáil is being recalled to hold a special debate on the imminent war and what's likely to happen with Shannon. For more news on Loch Commons boat, tune into News 2 on Network 2 at 11:15. But for now, from everyone on Primetime, have a very good night.